Hello, my name is Peter Whitehead. This is one of a series of talks which I've prepared for the Bromley U3A Art Appreciation Group during lockdown. The Art Appreciation Group is a collection of people who enjoy art, who enjoy discussing it, but we're not experts, so please view this presentation in that light. The subject of this talk is Gustave Courbet. I have chosen to call him the revolutionary realist. He's an influential painter who introduced the realist school of painting, which looked at modern subjects from everyday life. But Courbet himself was very committed to left-wing political causes. He was a radical, and therefore in the mid-19th century he was threatening, and the reaction to his paintings is sometimes as much political as artistic. Now, realism with a small r had been around in culture for a long time, but with the capital R that Courbet introduced, it focused on the artist's impression of the emerging modern world and also claimed a lot of artistic freedom by the artist. In literature, for instance, Balzac, Flaubert and Zola would follow a similar path. So, some biographical details. He was born into a prosperous middle-class farming family, although his grandfather had been a sans-culotte, a peasant supporter of the French Revolution. And his grandfather had given this advice to Courbet: shout loud and march straight ahead. And I think Courbet adopted that approach throughout his life. He was one of 5 children, the only son. After a failed attempt at training to be a lawyer, like quite a lot of artists I've come across, he started studio training in Paris, but left to pursue his own studies in the Louvre. We'll see where Ornans is in a minute on a map. It's quite important, I think, in Courbet's development and in the subject matter of his paintings. And here is a map of France, and Ornans is the red blob near the Swiss border. So in the east to southeast of France, in the foothills of the Alps, in an area known as Franche-Comté, which originally, back in the Middle Ages, was not part of France. It was part of the Duchy of Burgundy. In 1846, about 75% of the population of this area was rural, but as the Industrial Revolution in France gained pace, the peasant worker was created, so someone who worked under peasant conditions but not necessarily in an agricultural context. But Courbet definitely loved the landscape of the region and its occupations, including hunting, which in this case means shooting. And this is Courbet himself. This is a photograph from the 1860s. He had this to say about himself: I am not only a socialist, but a Democrat and a Republican as well. In a word, a partisan of the entire revolution, and above all, a realist with a capital R, a sincere lover of the veritable truth. Strange, isn't it, how people who believe in the truth, when it applies to them and agrees with what they want to believe. He also said, I'm probably the most arrogant man in France, which I think is quite a claim. In his early work, he's a great fan of self-portraits. So this one dates from when he's aged about 25, and it's one of a series of what you would have to say are romantic self-portraits. This is Courbet himself. there's a sword by his side. He's clearly been wounded, and he's been wounded in the heart. So he's been wounded by love. He's been unlucky in love, or he's been wounded by love's arrow, whichever you prefer. Now, Courbet led a bohemian lifestyle in Paris. He occupied the left bank with his left-wing associates, and in this period, in the mid to late 1840s, he was very much opposed to the monarchy of King Louis Philippe and its censorship. He was after a republic. Another self-portrait and another very romantic pose. The artist at the end of his tether. Courbet wasn't achieving much success at this time. He had one painting accepted into the Salon in 1844, but he was starting to make important connections. We think of Charles Baudelaire as a poet. His dates are 1821 to 1867, but he was also an influential political thinker and art critic. He was a great supporter at this time of the Romantic painters Delacroix and Géricault. But he was also the creator of the concept of modernity, so modern urban living as opposed to the rural majority of France. And he was a great believer in the responsibility of artists to reflect that existence, the modern existence. And hence he was a great supporter of realism, because that was what realism was attempting to do. He wrote an essay on the 1846 Salon in which he said, "Art is the expression of the ethos of the age." The painting itself, I think, is quite tentative. It's a question of whether it's actually fully finished, and you can see Baudelaire smoking there, but there is a question of what he's actually smoking in that tiny little pipe. It might well be opium. The other connection which Courbet made was with this chap, Proudhon, Pierre-Joseph Proudhon. This is a much later painting. In fact, after his death, he didn't allow paintings to be made of him during his lifetime. His dates are 1809 to 1865. And he's a socialist politician, philosopher, economist. He was an associate of Karl Marx and the first anarchist. If you've ever heard the phrase "property is theft," that comes from Proudhon. And he was imprisoned in the late 1840s and early 1850s, and later exiled in Belgium for his political views. He's from the same part of the country as Courbet, and unfortunately is also a virulent anti-Semite, which was not unusual in France at the time, but no more and no less despicable for that being the case. So he's associated with someone in artistic circles like Baudelaire and political circles like Proudhon. In 1846-47, Courbet travels to the Netherlands and Belgium, and he sees the works of the Dutch old masters there, and he's influenced by those, particularly the works of Rembrandt and Frans Hals. So the pipe and the long hair are the symbols of bohemianism. Again, you could question what's being smoked in that pipe. And one critic, when he saw this painting, called it Christ with a pipe. But 1848 is a time of great political upheaval, the year of revolutions. The July Revolution overthrew King Louis Philippe, and the Second Republic was formed, much to the delight of Courbet and his associates. But the hope of a left-wing government was dashed when Prince Louis Napoleon, the nephew of Napoleon Bonaparte, was elected president in December 1848. In all this turmoil, there was no jury ever set up for the 1848 Salon, so all of Courbet's entries to that salon were hung, along with 5,500 other works. However, the following year, Courbet submits, and this is accepted, After Dinner at Ornans. It's a scene in his hometown. The figure on the left is his father with his associates. They're sitting down after dinner. Someone is playing the violin. They're smoking a pipe, having something to drink. It's an everyday scene, what would be termed, if you were to classify the art, as genre painting. This particular painting was awarded a medal at the Salon. So under the rules that applied at the time, Courbet didn't need to go through the jury process again to get his works into the Salon until 1857, that is when the rules were changed. So this work was bought by the state for 1,500 francs. It's large. It's over 6 foot tall. The peasants and the workers in the painter are not idealised. There's no real story, there's no narrative, but it does emulate the Dutch Old Masters which Courbet had seen. There's a quite luxurious texture. The use of light and shade is very much influenced by the Dutch paintings, and it's in the Dutch tradition of a group portrait, but in the Dutch tradition the group in the portrait would normally be a group of powerful people, if you think of Rembrandt's Night Watch. But Courbet is just reflecting everyday life in rural France here. He's painting individuals, not types. And one comment on this painting, when it was exhibited at the Salon, was that no one could drag art into the gutter with greater technical virtuosity. So while his skill as a painter was admired, his choice of subject matter was not popular. It was not the role of art to paint everyday people, certainly not on this grand scale. Now, it wasn't unusual, you have to say, at this time for their painters to depict workers and peasants. This is a painting by Millet, whose dates are 1814 to 1875, a member of the Barbizon School of Painters, situated just outside Paris. This school painted peasants and workers, but it's a slightly romanticised portrayal. It's depersonalised, the faces are hidden. It reflects the dignity of labour and the acceptance of their lot. These workers are not crying out for change. So this is a very conservative morality depicted in these paintings. And here's another later one by Millet, possibly a bit more famous. And it's really a kind of pastoral utopianism. This is the happy poor. But in fact, what these women are doing is after the harvest, you can see the harvest going on in the background, in the centre of the painting there, they're picking up whatever they can find that has been left after the harvest. They're reduced to hand picking in the fields to see what they can acquire. in order to live, basically. So Courbet does depict similar scenes, but in Courbet's world, this kind of labour is backbreaking. Again, we've got the faceless figures. These are two workmen by the road that Courbet is meant to have seen on his journey back to Ornans from Paris. The painting, again, it was more or less life-size. You can see that there's an older man and a younger man. They're dressed really in rags. The boy's shirt is torn at the back. He's wearing hand-me-down clothes. His boots, what's left of them, are just about holding together. The old man has got a hole in his socks, wearing clogs, and you can see the effort he's putting into breaking stone for road repairs. And Courbet called this democratic realism. Now, after the Conservative victory in the 1848 elections, of course, the left wing were looking to regenerate their support, and Courbet was seized upon as someone who could help them do that. Proudhon wrote about this painting that it depicted the servitude of the proletariat changed to labour, so a very left-wing, almost communist interpretation of the painting. But you can also see this painting as an homage to Millet, because if we put the winnower and stonebreakers alongside each other, one of the figures anyway, you can see the pose replicated by Courbet from the earlier work. Unfortunately, you can't go and see the painting The Stonebreakers anymore. It was destroyed in Dresden in February 1945 in the bombing of the city by the Allies. I'm not sure, I haven't been able to find whether it was actually owned by, say, the Dresden Art Gallery at the time, or whether it had been looted by the Nazis and taken back to Germany. But in any event, the painting doesn't exist anymore, destroyed in the bombing at the end of the Second World War. But Courbet was moving on to a couple of his most famous paintings. This is a burial at Ornans, and I've wanted first of all to give you an idea of its size, because it's important in the way it's received. So it's 10 foot high and 22 feet long, as you can see in this photograph, which gives you a sense of the size of it. So it's the size of a history painting, but in subject matter it's a genre painting, the painting of everyday life. It's a burial. We don't really know whose burial it is at Ornans. But what it doesn't have, a genre painting in the style of, say, Millet, would be expected to have a certain amount of sentimentality attached to it, particularly as it's a funeral. But this one doesn't. It crosses boundaries between types of art. So this is the painting itself. The figures are, as you can see, life-size, and they're recognisable local figures. We don't know whose burial it is. There's a coffin being borne in on the left-hand side of the painting. It could be Courbet's grandfather, who had died around this time, but he's actually portrayed as one of the figures in the painting. Some interpret it as an almost allegorical painting. What this is the burial of Romanticism, but I think that's possibly over-egging it. But what you can say, it's very frieze-like, because the figures seem almost stuck onto the background, which is something that you'll see in other Courbet paintings. The painting was actually too big to fit into Courbet's studio, so he couldn't really see the whole painting when he was working on it. Now, realism is associated with anarchism, and the politics of Proudhon. So it's all about the overthrow of the established order, and death is the great leveller. You also have to consider where the viewer is standing in this painting. The hole that you can see is obviously much too small to contain the coffin, so that we as the viewer must be standing at the far end of that hole, at the head of the grave, say. This was the highlight of the 1850-1851 Salon. There'd been more political upheaval at this time because Louis Napoleon, who'd been elected president 3 years previously, was coming to the end of his term of office and decided to stage a coup d'etat and declare himself emperor, start the Second Empire, and he would become Napoleon III of Camden Place, Chislehurst fame. Well, again, the critics admired the skill of the painting, but decried the poverty of the ideas. Why would you almost waste so much effort on ordinary people? One of the comments made was, "Monsieur Courbet has made himself a place in the current French school of art in the manner of a cannonball that has just embedded itself in a wall." So they recognised the impact that Courbet was having, even if they didn't really support what he was doing. This is a portrait of Courbet at the time, the earliest known, a photograph, the earliest known photograph of Courbet. He does look slightly on the arrogant side, you must admit. This is by Lasnais and Defond, this photograph. Courbet took the painting, A Burial at Ornans, to Frankfurt at this time, and he broke with tradition by charging for admission to an exhibition to see the painting, and in doing so he made a great deal of money, and it gave him a good idea for what he was going to do in future. He was also interviewed in 1852 by a writer called Théophile Sylvestre for a book on living artists, and this is what he had to say. So he's very self-assured. "I am the first and only artist of this century." I think probably Delacroix and Ingres might have had something to say about that, but they're dismissed as drivellers. "I can make my judgment in morality, politics and poetry as well as in painting." So this is reflecting how his politics influence everything that he does in art. "I do what I have to do. I am indeed the most arrogant man in the world, not just in France." So in 1853, there are a couple of companion pieces that Courbet produces. The Wrestlers here you might consider as a realistic version of a classical nude. So the Wrestlers is a well-known sculpture from the classical period, and Courbet takes that and brings it up to date, because these are wrestlers who you could have seen in Paris in the Bois de Boulogne, I think, in 1853. But again, you do get the feel as if the figures are almost cut out of the background, and partly this is due to the technique that Courbet had to adopt of painting in the studio and then grafting on a plein air setting in the background. It doesn't quite work sometimes. The grandstand, of course, is much too far away. Why would you have a grandstand right there in the distance? They can't see what's going on, and the figures in the grandstand are very sketchily painted. But it's part of a process where Courbet starts saying, well, there are there are academic traditions in art really based on the classical world. I'm going to challenge those. So the Wrestlers is challenging the male nude. The Bathers challenges the female nude, and it's almost a parody of classical subjects, classical nudes. So it's a parody of Venus rising from the waves, or more probably paintings you see of Diana surprised at her bath in the woods. Very classical subjects, but the nude in question does not have the proportions of a classical nude. It's very Rubenesque, a very, shall we say, well-fed young lady. And Napoleon III saw this painting at the Salon, I think, and was vastly amused by it. Thought it was one of the funniest things he'd ever seen, and he was carrying his riding crop with him, and he slapped the woman in the painting on the backside with his riding crop. You know, she's got the same backside as a horse, was the message. The painting itself was bought by someone who was an important patron of Courbet, Alfred Bruas. We'll see him in a minute. And of course, Proudhon rode to Courbet's defence on this painting and gave it a political meaning. This is the plump and affluent bourgeoisie, a suffocating idealism. So this painting's got a number of titles. The Meeting, Good Morning Monsieur Courbet. It's also known, or was referred to, as Fortune Bowing to Genius, because on the right we have, with the distinctive jutting beard, we have Courbet himself. He's just got off the carriage, which you can see on the far right. He's got his painting materials on his back, and he's arrived home at Ornon to be greeted by his wealthy patron, Alfred Bruas, and his servant and a dog. It's an allegorical meeting, if you like, of art and patronage, or genius and patronage, and you have to say who is the heroic figure in this painting, and you'd have to say probably it's Courbet himself. And the rich man who is his patron is doffing his hat, and his servant is actually bowing to Courbet, and even the dog is looking at him with admiration. The most arrogant man in France. It's also interesting, I don't think you can see it in this reproduction, that but the technique used here by Courbet uses a palette knife extensively rather than brushes, so you get a thick layer of paint, but I don't think that's really reflected in this reproduction that you can see here. For a realist, it's quite surprising how many allegories Courbet produces, but you have to ask the title of this painting, The Painter's Studio, A Real Allegory. Well, what's a real allegory? That's a contradiction in terms. But he also described it as the moral and physical history of my studio over the last 7 years. So what are we seeing in this painting? It's essentially a triptych. There's 3 elements to this painting. There's the centre panel, the one on the left and the one on the right, and they stand for different things. In the centre is the artist. He's painting landscape of his home area around Ornon. He is being admired by a young boy who is watching him at work, and then standing behind him is a naked lady, and he's completely ignoring her. And the naked lady might be, in an allegorical situation, considered academic art, so the accepted art of the culture at the time. On the right are Courbet's, what he called his shareholders, his friends and supporters. On the left, the exploiters and the exploited. It's another massive canvas on the scale of the burial, a burial at Ornans, which I think is the painting you can see on the right there. It was tended for the Universal Exposition of 1855. You can look at some of the details. This is the right-hand panel, if you like, the friends and admirers, the shareholders. Baudelaire is there in much the same pose as he was in his 1848 portrait. On the right, Brouard, the Patron, is the second figure from the left. There are other recognisable figures. Proudhon is there as well, somewhere as well. The people who've supported Courbet. And on the left-hand side, the world of the trivial life, the exploiters and the exploited. There's a Jew holding a casket. There's a priest. There's a veteran of the French Revolution. There's a hunter. There's a reaper. There's a buffoon. There's a textile peddler. There's an undertaker. But they're all actually recognisable figures, or mainly. And the most recognisable one, the character in the foreground, the hunter with the dog, actually has got the features of the Emperor Napoleon III. Now, the 1855 Exposition Universelle was held in the Champs-Élysées. Courbet submitted 14 works, including A Burial at Ornans and The Artist's Studio. They were rejected mainly because of their size. They would have taken up the whole exhibition space. Courbet is undaunted by this, and he sets up his own pavilion, the Pavilion of Realism, of 44 paintings and drawings, and he charged entry, as he had done in Frankfurt. And the catalogue, which we can see here, also included what's known as the Realist Manifesto on the right there in French. It seems that this time everyone needs a manifesto of some kind, and this is Courbet's, and this is the English translation of what's written there. I think the key points of this I've highlighted. He says, I've studied all the art of the classical period and the more modern. I don't wish to imitate or copy that, and that's an attack on academic art, because the academic art training of the time was basically to copy from classical and Renaissance works. The goal of art for art's sake is useless. In other words, art must have a purpose. And the final sentence, I think, defines what realism is. To translate the custom, the ideas, the appearance of my epoch, so of the modern world, according to my own appreciation of it, in other words, his political views, that is what he is trying to achieve. It led to a certain amount of conflict and debate, the two schools of art battling it out. Daumier is a French cartoonist of the time. Idealism, represented on the right, is basically what we would call classicism. Here's a naked chap in a Roman helmet, but he seems to be rather elderly. He doesn't seem to have any teeth, and he's wearing glasses. And he's using his palette as a shield, and then he's aiming the spear-like instrument that he's aiming at realism is actually a mahl stick. It's a tool that painters use to support their arm while they're painting. So he's battling with the figure of realism. The realism seems to have outgrown his clothes. They're all rather too small for him. He's wearing clogs, so he supports the workers, and his chosen weapon, if you like, is a rather large brush. It's the type of brush that a house painter might have used, and his shield is a small palette which would have been used for painting outdoors. But the two schools of painting are battling. Now, there was more scandal at the 1857 Salon. This painting, The Young Women of the Banks of the Seine. The young lady in the foreground has actually stripped to her undergarments. She's covered by a shawl, such as might have been depicted in portraits by Ingres. But it's fairly clear that these women are prostitutes. If you look in the boat, there is a man's hat, so they are not here on this island in the Seine alone. And those of you who studied French at A-level probably read the stories of Maupassant or books of Émile Zola. Boat trips down the Seine are always of dubious morality. It's where the city dwellers went to find a bit of space. So this caused a bit of a scandal in 1857 at the Salon, mainly because of the subject matter, but Courbet dismisses all that. He goes off to Germany in 1858, 1859, has a very successful period there. He enters the stage of his career when he produces lots of landscapes, hunting scenes, all of which were very popular and very successful economically. And for a more limited market, he starts producing paintings of nude women. By 1861, he's back at the Salon. He's showing hunting scenes, and these are very popular. Courbet's not really considered as a landscape artist, but actually landscapes can constitute 2/3 of his output. And in this painting, he combines history with nature. Vercingetorix, for those of you who studied Latin, will probably have come across him as the tribal leader of the Gauls, who was defeated by Julius Caesar. So you're matching a realistic depiction of nature here with historical undertones of the ancient Gauls and their battle against Rome. Now, Courbet could charge between 2,000 and 15,000 francs for a painting, so he was doing pretty well, but there's more outrage on the horizon. If we go back to the Salon in 1863, this painting, The Return from the Conference, was excluded from both the Salon and the Salon des Refusés in 1863. It was called an outrage on religious morality, a satire on the church. So you have a group of priests returning from a conference. Obviously they've overindulged, they're being laughed at by the peasants on the route. They're not very one of them is actually being held up, isn't he? He's practically collapsed through drunkenness, and one of them is riding on a donkey. Predictably, the painting was defended by Proudhon in a book on the principle of art and its social purpose. Republican France was constantly in conflict with the Catholic Church, so that left-wingers politically were always also anti-clerical. They didn't support the church. Now, the painting itself vanished under mysterious circumstances. That's why you only see a print here. it's thought that someone bought it in order to destroy it because of the attack on the church. But 1866, and Courbet's back in favour. Two paintings that he exhibited in 1866 are typical of his work at this time. The first one, the nude, the unrestrained long hair is very sexual, the parrot is exotic, and the painting itself is slightly reminiscent of Manet's Olympia, which had been painted in 1863, and paintings of Harem, a Turkish bath by Anger. And the other painting is one of Courbet's landscape oblique hunting scenes. Some of his hunting scenes are very graphic, which I choose not to show them. I think it's not something that I support. But here's a landscape and hunting combined in a scene that is perhaps not so bloody as some of Courbet's other works. Quite dark, browns, greens, but it reflects deer's sheltering in the depths of the forest. But now we come back again to some more controversial works. Khalil Bey was the former Turkish ambassador to Russia. He was a wealthy gambler and art collector. He was actually in Paris to be treated for syphilis. Again, the painting has similarities with Anger's paintings of Turkish baths, but it reflects the levels of prostitution and sexual license in Paris during the Second Empire, during the reign of Emperor Napoleon III. There's obviously a very strong sexual charge to this painting. Courbet asked 20,000 francs for this painting, which Bey said was too much, so Courbet decided to throw in a second painting, which is this one. Now, I'm not going to show it to you for reasons that will become clear, but I can describe it. It's the portrait of a nude female torso, but it's in a realistic style. It's totally as nature intended. It rejects the idealization of the female body and genitalia of the classical world, and the male body for that matter. The title makes it clear that what is depicted here is the place from which we all emerge. Now, if you're interested and not going to be shocked, you can find the painting online or in books about Courbet nowadays. But it was hidden for many years, and it leads to the question, is art, which basically depicts the female genitalia in detail, is it art or is it pornography? Well, the painting itself was never exhibited before 1988, and although it had been owned by the French state since the 1950s, it was not displayed in the Musée d'Orsay until 1991. It was considered that controversial. And the first owner, Khalil Bey, actually kept it behind a green curtain. He pulled back the curtain to reveal the painting to selected guests. And then from 1899, it was hidden away behind another painting. So you had to slide one other painting to the side so you could see this particular one. Interestingly, it was quite often referred to in books, but the illustration in the books was actually a fake produced by Magritte, of all people. So the way in which the painting was handled suggests it was viewed as pornography, but now it's very much celebrated by feminists, and artists such as Tracy Emin can be found on YouTube absolutely praising the painting and praising Courbet for showing a woman as she really is. Of course, it's quite difficult to tell who is actually the woman in the painting. It may well have been this lady, Joanna Heffernan. She was actually Whistler's mistress originally, and then she defected to Courbet. 1867, there's another Exposition Universelle. This is a plan of the site. It was on the Champ de Mars, so where the Eiffel Tower is now, but this is not the exhibition for which the Eiffel Tower was built. But it is the exhibition where, for the first time, Japanese works of art are exhibited in the West. There's a Japanese pavilion showing Japanese prints, and this becomes a great inspiration to all artists towards the end of the 19th century. 9 of Courbet's paintings were accepted for display in this exhibition, but this didn't stop him mounting a personal exhibition again in the Place de l'Alma of 140 of his works. In the 1860s, he visited Normandy quite often to paint seascapes. In fact, he produced vast numbers of them. He would almost had a production line going. He would produce one of these paintings in 2 hours, again making great use of a palette knife. But obviously it's a subject matter that we're familiar with because it's tackled by Monet later, who visited Entretat and painted the same scenes. Courbet had a very strange relationship with the French government. He rejected them politically, but he was quite often seeking commissions from the government, from connections in the government. The half-brother of Napoleon III was someone that he cultivated in the hope of winning commissions. In 1870, Courbet's offered the Légion d'honneur, and surprise, surprise, he turns it down. He says, art is outside the state's jurisdiction. But 1870 is a year of upheaval. Napoleon III is trapped by Bismarck into a war and very quickly defeated in September 1870 and abdicates, and this is when he comes to eventually to Chislehurst. The Prussians occupy Ornans and besiege Paris. The Parisians are reduced to having to eat the animals in the zoo to stay alive. And in this state of being besieged by the Prussians, a commune, the Paris Commune, is appointed to run Paris, and the commune is in opposition to the national government. Courbet is appointed councillor for the 6th arrondissement, which is the heart of the left bank. He's the president of the Federation of Artists and head of a committee to protect works of art in the capital. But this column in the Place Vendôme, just behind the Palace of the Tuileries, which were burned down in 1870, led to Courbet's downfall. It commemorates the victory of Napoleon at Austerlitz, but Courbet argued that it should be taken down, and the bas-relief on the column, in the style of Trajan's column in Rome, should be redeployed to Les Invalides instead. But on the 18th of May 1871, when Paris is under the control of the Commune, the column is torn down by a mob. So tearing down statues is not a new phenomenon, apparently. 20 days later, the government regained control of Paris and started taking action against the leaders of the Commune. Courbet was arrested on the 7th of June. He was sentenced to 6 months imprisonment and a 500 franc fine, with 6,850 francs costs. But he was treated better than some of the leaders of the Commune because they were sentenced to death. But what Courbet was held responsible for was the destruction of the column. In this cartoon from May 1871, although the date on it is in the French Revolutionary calendar, you can see Courbet there in the pose with the jutting beard. That's clearly him in the red sash of the communards, pushing over. But it isn't a column. It's actually, while the gentleman is fleeing quite quickly, he's pushing over one of the pissoirs that one used to find around Paris at the time. But he's obviously held responsible. Citizen Courbet is held responsible for the fact that the column in the Place Vendôme has been destroyed. And once the Commune had been overthrown and the government had restored control in Paris, there follows the election of a very conservative government under President MacMahon, and he instituted civil proceedings to force Courbet to pay for the reconstruction of the column. So Courbet painted himself in prison. Saint-Pélagie was the prisoner that he was confined in. He's wearing the red scarf of the communards, and you also at this time get an idea of how he felt. This is a painting of a trout hooked with a line in its mouth, probably how Courbet felt at this time. So France has really become too hot for Courbet, so he fled to Switzerland, but he was pursued over this column that had been destroyed. In 1877 he's ordered to pay 323,000 francs, and that's about 1.4 million pounds in today's money, to pay for the costs of reconstruction. They did allow him to pay instalments of 10,000 francs a year due from 1878, so that would have taken him 32 years to pay back until he was 90. But Courbet had fled in exile to try and protect his assets. He was drinking absinthe heavily and developing a rather impressive 55-inch waist. Unsurprisingly, he died on the 31st of December 1877 in Switzerland at the age of 58, one day before the payment of the first instalment of the money was due. So that's the end of Courbet. He's an influential painter on later artists. Cézanne admired his landscapes, as did Manet, and he certainly paved the way for the end of Romanticism, which led the way to Impressionism and later Cubism. So that's the end of this talk. I hope it's inspired you to go and have a look at a few more of Courbet paintings, and I hope you listen to some of the other talks in this series. Thank you very much.